In this last video, we're going to look at Thomson's reply to the revised pro-life argument and see why she thinks that in essential cases, in many essential cases, a woman does have a right to an abortion provided by her bodily autonomy. And this is going to turn on the issue of ethical responsibility. We saw in the previous video, the pro-life proponent has the following view. If a mother is ethically responsible for the existence of the fetus or embryo, that gives the fetus or embryo a right to use the mother's body, and that right to use the mother's body at that point then overrides the mother's autonomy, and the mother loses the right. Then mother's bodily autonomy no longer allows her to have an abortion. And so what Thomson is going to need to argue is that, in fact, the mother is not ethically responsible, and that, therefore, the fetus does not in that way gain a right to use the mother's body. So she thinks, the key thing, remember there are a couple of cases where abortion looks like it's going to be permissible already in this debate. One is in the case of self-defense if the mother's health is at issue, and the other is in the case of pregnancy arising from non-consensual sex. In both of those cases, in one case the mother has a right to self-defense, and in the other case the fetus does not gain a right to use the mother's body. Why not? Well, because the sex that produced the pregnancy and the fetus or embryo's existence was non-consensual. So the issue then is, what about in consensual sex? Thomson thinks if a woman uses birth control but it fails, then she is not care responsible. She is not ethically responsible for the resulting pregnancy, and so the fetus has not gained a right to life to use the mother's. The fetus's right to life has not given the fetus a right to use the mother's body. So Thomson provides an analogy that she thinks supports her view that if the mother has used birth control, then the mother is not become ethically responsible and does not lose and does not give to the fetus a right to use the mother's body. And the analogy has to do with a home intruder case. So let's suppose that you have your house, okay, or you have a house, apartment, whatever, you're in it, and you decide to open the window. Surely you can open the window. Let's suppose that there's a bar or screens or something up on the window that, are a basic way to prevent, someone from coming into the house. Let's suppose that somehow, through some freak accident, an intruder falls through the barred open window. Perhaps there's an earthquake, and the bars break, and the intruder falls in. Or who knows, whatever. Somehow or other, the intruder falls. There's this open window. There's someone outside the house. You haven't given the person permission to enter the house. The bars are up, and then through some freak accident, the person falls through the window anyway. Okay? So the bars fail. So now, ask yourself, can you, as the owner, do you have a right to eject this intruder? Well, you might think, yeah, the owner can eject the intruder. But note that the intruder has a right to not be moved around, right? In general, if you're in a place, you can't be forced to move from that place. But if it's not if it's public property, you can't be forced to move. If it's your own property, you can't be forced to move. But if it's someone else's private property, can you be forced to move? Well, it depends. If you've been invited in, then maybe the invitation has to be retracted. But if you've been invited in, then the owner can't just suddenly shove you out of the house. But if you've fallen, but what about in this case? In this case, presumably the homeowner does have a right to eject the intruder from the house. The intruder was not invited, and this is even though the intruder has a right not to be moved around. So the owner's property right, overrides the intruder's right to not be moved around in these cases. Well, and this is even though the bars failed, right? So the homeowner has a property right. They didn't lose their property right because of the failure of the bars. The homeowner's property right initially overrides the intruder's right, and the homeowner retains their property right even though the bars fail. So initially, property right to eject. Bars fail, intruder comes in. Homeowner still has a right to eject the intruder, even though the intruder has this, and the homeowner's property right still overrides the intruder's right to not be moved around. The key thing is that the owner does not lose the property right because of the open window. The open window does not by itself make up an invitation to enter. The bars are a barrier to entry, and so although the owner has opened the window and thus made it possible for the intruder to enter, or at least increase the likelihood that the intruder can enter, it's harder to get in if there's a closed window. Nonetheless, the owner has also put up the bars and tried to prevent the the other person from entering, and therefore the owner does not lose their property right even though they've opened the window. So this is supposed to be an extended analogy between home invasion or home intrusion and pregnancy. So we have the home invasion, and that's analogous to the pregnancy, right? The intruder is in the house, the zygote embryo fetus is in the uterus. So the homeowner opens the window but has bars, so on the one hand the window's open, but there's steps have been taken to prevent intruders. So similarly, we imagine a woman has consensual sex and uses good birth control, so the possibility of pregnancy has gone up because of the consensual sex, but steps have been taken to prevent the pregnancy, namely the good birth control. Now in the home invasion case we're imagining, the innocent intruder falls through the window. The analogy here is that the zygote is instantly fertilized by the sperm innocently getting past the birth control. So the intruder has the right to move around, which in general prevents other people from moving them around. Similarly, we're assuming that the zygote and embryo and fetus have a right to life that in general prevents entities from killing them. But the owner of the house has a right over the house, has a property right over the house, and similarly, the mother has bodily autonomy over her body. And the property right allows the injection of the intruder, and so similarly, the idea is that the bodily autonomy allows the abortion. And in particular, and this is the key last element of the analogy, the owner doesn't lose their property right because they opened the barred window, right? They did open the window. That made it more likely that someone would enter, even though they didn't want someone to enter, but they put bars on the window. They have a reasonable expectation that no one can get in, and then there's this freak accident and someone does get in. So the claim is that this is exactly the same as birth control. So when the woman has consensual sex, but one or the other of the couple use birth control, then that's like putting up the bars on the window. And just as the bars on the window mean that the owner has retained their property right, so the use of birth control means that the woman has retained her bodily autonomy. Even though in this freak case, just as there's a freak case, the intruder falls in through the bars, so the sperm gets through the birth control. And it's worth pointing out the birth control in general is highly, highly effective. It's not perfect, but it's highly effective. It's just about as likely that an intruder would fall through a barred window as that a woman will get pregnant if they have consensual sex but are using good birth control. So that's Thomson's view. If I take good care to avoid a certain outcome, is a bad outcome not my fault? Well, in lots of cases it's not. In the home intrusion case, it's not. If I drive safely and well but cause an accident, I'm not guilty of a crime or wrongdoing. And similarly, Thomson claims that nature basically has conspired against the woman when birth control fails. That's not her fault. She took steps to prevent that outcome, steps that are normally highly, highly effective, and yet nature has let her down. That is not her fault. She is not ethically responsible for the outcome. There's a general difficult issue here about what's called moral luck, which is when do I become ethically responsible for the lucky or unlucky outcomes of my actions? And in general, we think, well, if you don't intend the outcome, you took steps to prevent the outcome and so on, you're not responsible, but that's not always the case. So Thomson's view here is not obvious, and you might be sort of skeptical of it, but it's worth pointing out that there's a lot to be said for it, that in lots and lots and lots of cases, when you take steps to prevent an outcome, if the outcome happens anyway through forces beyond your control, you are not ethically responsible for the outcome. And so when a couple use birth control that is in general highly effective, and then it's not effective in that particular case and a pregnancy results, that's like these cases. These other cases where we think you're not responsible for the outcome because of the steps you took to prevent the outcome. So this leads Thomson to the following conclusions about when abortion is permissible. When a pregnancy threatens the life, the mother's right to self-defense allows abortion. Now, the fetus also has a right to self-defense, and so the fetus might, act on that self-defense. So we have sort of two innocent agents, each with a right of self-defense. So the fetus may have a right to resist, but the mother has a right to terminate the pregnancy. Whereas the fetus is not going to really be able to resist, but the mother's bodily autonomy provides an initial block to the embryo or fetus's right to use the mother's body. So, absent any special conditions, the mother has bodily autonomy, and that allows her to say, no one gets to use my body without my permission for the support of their life, and that includes the embryo or the fetus. Now, as we've seen, the embryo or fetus might gain a right to use the mother's body, but Thomson points out that there are several cases where the embryo or fetus does not gain that right. So, in there's non-consensual sex, and that's just like the violinist case. You're kidnapped and attached to the violinist. So similarly, in non-consensual sex, the mother is effectively kidnapped and attached to the embryo or fetus. And the immoral action of kidnapping or non-consensual sex does not decrease the victim's rights, and so the embryo or fetus does not gain the right to use the mother's body. Finally, in the case of consensual sex with birth control, Thomson analogizes that to the intruder case and says that just as the intruder does not gain the right to be in the house even though the window is opened, so the embryo or fetus does not gain the right to use the mother's body even though consensual sex was had. Why? Well, because in both cases, steps were taken to prevent the pregnancy or the intruder from being in the house in the first place, even though there was consensual sex or the window was opened. However, if a couple have consensual sex, knowingly don't use birth control, understanding the implications, then one might think that in fact that person has the mother has taken over ethical responsibility for the zygote or embryo or fetus, and so if the zygote, embryo, or fetus does have a right to life in the first place, then that right to life would extend to a right to use the mother's body. There would still be the self-defense issue. The mother would still have a right to self-defense, but the bodily autonomy in that case may have been limited by taking on responsibility for the zygote and embryo or fetus by having consensual sex that is knowingly unprotected. So, when does a parent become ethically responsible? We were just saying possibly by the act of consensual, knowingly unprotected sex. Thomson thinks that a parent assumes responsibility by taking a child home. I would suggest that maybe a mother assumes responsibility by knowingly allowing a pregnancy to continue when she has the option to terminate it, right? Once you know that you're pregnant and you choose, okay, I want the pregnancy to continue, then at that point, I think it's reasonable to say, okay, maybe you've taken on responsibility for the pregnancy and for the child, or at that point, the zygote or embryo or fetus, whatever stage it's at. One question that I think is worth thinking about for Thomson is, when does a father become responsible? We think that fathers are ethically responsible for their children. They should be involved in the lives of their children, and if they aren't, they're doing something wrong. Thomson has set the bar relatively low for when a mother becomes relatively high. A mother has to do a whole bunch to become ethically responsible for the child. Well, what about a father? When does a father become ethically responsible? It looks like the bar would presumably be set equally high for when a father would become ethically responsible. And we might think that bar has been set a little bit too high, so that's an issue to think about more for Thomson is, okay, what does her view about ethical responsibility tell us about when fathers are ethically responsible, and do we agree with that result or not? So before we finish up, I want to make one point about what exactly the abortion right is that Thomson is defending. So let's think about the violinist case again for a second. What you have is a right to detach the violinist. You don't actually have a right to kill the violinist. It's just that happens as a result of detaching the violinist. You don't in general have a right to kill the violinist. And so similarly, the mother has a right to end a threatening pregnancy in the case of the self-defense, or just has a right to end use of her body by the fetus when autonomy is the relevant right. If that results in the death of the embryo or fetus, then the mother has a right to kill the embryo or fetus. But if ending the embryo or fetus's use of her body can be done without killing the embryo or fetus, then she doesn't have a further right to kill the embryo or fetus, right? She only has a right to sever the use of her body and whatever is required for that. She doesn't have any right beyond that. So we've been talking about a right to kill, or whether or not to kill the fetus, and what we really want to say is a right to end the use of the fetus or embryo's use of the body, which given up to a certain point was going to amount to a right to kill the fetus. But once the fetus is viable, then at that point, on Thomson's view, we might say, well, okay, at that point, the mother does not have a right to for the fetus to die. What she has is a right to end the pregnancy, and then the fetus will be kept alive, outside of the womb. So that's an implication of her view. Okay, so to summarize Thomson then, and to finish up with this video and this unit, she thinks the embryo and an early fetus probably do not have a right to life, but she's going to suppose that they did. Well, the right to life itself is not absolute. In particular, it does not by itself give the embryo or fetus the right to use the mother's body. If a pregnancy is threatening, if it's non-consensual, or if the mother is otherwise not ethically responsible for the pregnancy, then the mother's rights allow termination of the pregnancy. The fetus, in those situations, the embryo or fetus does not have a right to use the mother's body, and the mother's bodily autonomy allows the termination of the pregnancy. In such cases, abortion isn't wrong. It may or may not be indecent or bad, depending upon the details of the situation. We haven't gotten into situations where Thomson would say it's indecent or bad, or just, entirely unproblematic. So, open question, when is the mother ethically responsible? Precisely, when is the mother not ethically responsible? Those questions are still somewhat open. We've seen some of Thomson's views on the issue, but we haven't seen them all, and we might disagree with them, or we might want to probe them further. We might even want to go back and say, look, I disagree with the whole premise of the debate. I think that it's wrong to detach yourself from the violinist. Once you're attached to the violinist does have a right to use your body, and similarly, once an embryo or fetus is dependent on a woman's body, it has a right to use their body. So that would be a place to get off the Thomson train early on. But if you agree that you have a right to detach yourself from the violinist, and there's good reason to think you do, because you're not required to attach yourself in the first place. So why are you required to remain attached? Then if you accept that, then you have to get into the issue of, okay, at what point does a fetus gain the right to use the mother's body? And up until that point, the mother's bodily autonomy allows her to terminate the pregnancy.